Welcome to Module 2 of Political Statistics. In the last lecture, we discussed concepts and why they're important in the use of statistics. We read Giovanni Sartori's Concept Misinformation in Comparative Politics and got oriented to the rhythm of the class. In this lecture, we'll start looking at the organization, manipulation, and visualization of data. As you begin to work with actual data, you'll quickly realize that running statistical tests and tweaking graphics, what most people consider the fun part of statistics and data science, is actually the easiest and smallest portion of what you do. Instead, most of your time will consist of cleaning and organizing messy data. You'll have to think about what to do with missing values, weird typos, how to change a continuous variable into a discrete one, and so on. Each of these involves decisions and choices, and each decision will have an impact on your final analysis. So before diving into all of that, it's useful to have a solid foundation for thinking about data and its organization. Let's get started. Data ought to be tidy. That's both a normative and a technical statement. In the former sense, we mean that our data, some amount of systematically collected and organized observations, ought to be easy to work with. Our variable names should make intuitive sense, there shouldn't be a lot of typos or mistakes, and the gap between having an idea for analysis and implementing that idea should be small. That's tidiness in the normative sense, but tidiness also refers to technical aspects of our data. In fact, there are three main characteristics of technically tidy data. In a tidy dataset, each column is one variable, each row is one observation, and each cell is one value. Let's take those one step at a time. A variable is a characteristic across which individual observations vary in expression. For example, let's say I was undertaking a study of what my students' favorite color is. I'd probably need two variables to start. First, I'd need a way to uniquely identify each student. That variable might be your university ID, for example. So my first column's name would be student_ID. Then I'd need a column under which I'd record your favorite color. I'd name that column favorite_color because that captures the concept I'm trying to measure. Next, in a tidy dataset, each row is an observation. In this example, my unit of observation is the student. Each row would be one student and only one student. Each row would uniquely identify a student. Finally, each cell in my tidy dataset would contain one and only one value. In this case, that means I'd go around the class, ask each of you your university ID and favorite color, and put your responses in two different cells. That's a tidy dataset. Having collected our data, we might quickly realize that our job isn't quite finished. Yes, it's tidy, but we may need to manipulate our data in some ways for it to be useful. Data still needs to be cleaned, recoded, and summarized, for example. And it's at this point that we really start down the garden of forking paths, where each decision we make has a potentially large impact on our final analysis. At this point, it's worth emphasizing that we really are making decisions about how to approach and analyze our data. Data never speaks for itself. Insights aren't floating around somewhere in there waiting for you to unlock them. Instead, they are the consequence of the decisions that you make. As noted in the last lecture, statistics don't produce objective answers. It produces answers that depend on your choices and the questions that you ask. So let's run through some common manipulations and consider the effect that different choices might have on an analysis. First, what do we do with misspelled observations? For some, where it's clearly a typo, the answer seems obvious. Obviously, this student meant to say blue and not glue, and this student meant to say red and not Ted. But what about a student who reports that their favorite color is blurple? Now, I can reasonably assume that they either meant blue or purple, or that they're just messing with me. And if you ever work with survey data, you'll quickly learn that there are always a few people who like messing with survey takers. But the question remains, what do I do with blurple observations? Let's think of our options as a branching path. At the first branch, we might consider whether to substitute the observation or not. If we choose not to change the value blurple to something else, we then have a new layer of branches. We could discard this observation altogether, keep it as blurple, and assume that the student meant what they said, or group all tough cases under an other category. On the other branch, we could change the value to blue or purple. Either way, something needs to be done, and even doing nothing is a choice. So what might be the implications of our choices? Well, if we chose to change the value to blue or purple, we might be overcounting the number of students who like those colors. It might give us a false impression that blue or purple are more popular than they seem. Or maybe there are a few students who said blurple and they all come from a community where that's a commonly understood color. I'd be undercounting perfectly valid colors by changing them. Likewise, if I just discarded all the blurples, grouping all of the difficult cases might also give us a false sense of homogeneity. After all, the observations that end up in the other category don't have anything in common other than that they're not blue, green, yellow, red, etc. Does it make conceptual sense to group them together? Of course, these are only partially problems of data manipulation. We might take a further step back and note that the way that I asked and structured the question might not have been consistent with a concept that I was trying to measure. Instead, I might have designed my question not as an open-ended prompt, but as a multiple-choice question with limited options. Our choices began even before we started manipulating our data. At this point, it'd be fair to point out that this political statistics course hasn't actually covered much of the theory of statistics, and you'd be right, but that's for a reason. I really want to emphasize that data isn't given. It's produced. Maybe not by you, but by someone who made choices about how to measure things and why. Conceptualization, measurement, manipulation, and visualization are all a part of the process of political analysis that happens to use statistics. And it's important not to forget that. Political scientists aren't wannabe statisticians, or at least they shouldn't see themselves as such. They are social theorists for whom statistics is a tool. If you don't consciously plan your research, tools end up using you rather than vice versa. Back to the material at hand. Let's say I chose not to make any changes beyond tweaking obvious typos. The blurples will remain blurples. My tidy dataset is now clean, and it's time to start doing something with it. But this dataset is far too large to just gaze at and extract insights. Instead, we need to summarize, and indeed, that's the whole point of statistics, to summarize. So, what kind of summaries might be useful? Well, first off, it'd be helpful to see the distribution of colors. How many students in total reported a given color as their favorite? We'll get into the technical details of how to do this in our labs, but for now, suffice it to say that we need to count up the number of reds, blues, greens, etc. So in our new summarized dataset, we'd have one column for the color variable, one column for the count variable, and one row per unique color in our dataset. In doing so, we've collapsed our huge dataset into something more manageable. And in fact, where we have tables, we can have graphics. The final step in our heuristic example is to visualize our data. See, my monkey brain isn't so good at comparing numbers, and given that I have the attention span of a goldfish, I don't like staring at huge tables of variables. It's boring and it's too much work. By contrast, graphics drive a point home. One bar is taller or shorter than another. Even my monkey brain can handle that. So let's talk about graphics. Luckily, our data is already in a tidy format, so we don't need to spend time getting it there. Instead, we can focus on the elements of a graphic. Though you probably haven't thought of it much, most good graphics have an underlying logic to them. You intuitively understand how to read charts, even though you've never seen most of them before. You know to look at axes, legends, and labels because those are usually the elements of graphics that carry information. You might not recognize them by those names, but I'm willing to bet that you have a good gut feeling about how charts work. So let's turn that gut feeling into something more systematic. For this class, we'll focus on 3 parts of graphics: the data, the aesthetics or axes, and the geomes or shapes. First, consider the data. We'll build on our favorite colors summarized example. Note that graphics are representations of data. They aren't the data itself. That means that for any given dataset, there are an enormous number of ways that we can visualize it. This point will become more apparent as we talk about aesthetics and geomes. In ggplot, each time you build a graphic, you need to let it know what data you want to visualize. That means setting the argument data equals to your object. Next, we need to consider our aesthetics or axes. Think of an aesthetic as an axis. There are obviously the X and Y axes that you're likely familiar with, but you also know that other characteristics of visualizations vary as well. For example, you've probably seen many scatter plots where the points change color depending on the value of that observation. Or maybe you've seen scatter plots where the size of the dot changes. Size, color, X and Y position. Each of these are aesthetics because they represent variables that encode information. But for now, let's keep it simple. All aesthetics in ggplot go inside the brackets of the AES function inside your ggplot code. We'll tell ggplot that we want the color variable on the x-axis and the count variable on the y-axis. Luckily, it'll figure out how to translate that into actual visualizations for us. What's important is that we're telling it what variables should go to which axes or aesthetics. Lastly, we need to consider geomes or shapes. It may initially seem odd that we have to specify the shape for our visualization. After all, weren't we going to build a bar chart this whole time? Well, not necessarily. Our data and aesthetic mapping are consistent with a few different shapes. For example, we might use a point or a dot plot or just a regular old bar chart. We can represent the underlying data in a number of ways given our aesthetic mapping. With our graphic in hand, let's step back a second and, as we did with data manipulation, consider all the points at which we made decisions while making this graphic. There are 2 points that stand out. First, we had to decide how to map our variables onto aesthetics. Second, we had to decide what geomes to use. At the first split, we could have assigned color to the X variable and size to the Y variable, or vice versa. At the second split, we could have chosen any number of shapes, but let's keep it simple and say that we could have chosen points or bars. 4 different charts representing the same information, but which each leave us with a different impression. Some of these charts require more work to interpret than others, and consequently don't make the point that we hope they make. None are the objectively correct graph. They are each the consequence of our choices. Remember, political research is about choices. With that, let's summarize for the day. Today, we discussed data. We talked about its organization, manipulation, and visualization. We went through the theory of each and discussed the importance of choices in each step. Next time, we'll talk about measures of central tendency. I'm looking forward to seeing you in Module 3.